Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann. Today I'm going to do a little Nonfiction November wrap up. I'm a little bit late. I'm recording this on December 18th, but we do what we can. So I'm going to talk about two of my Nonfiction November picks. I will put a link up to my Nonfiction November TBR. And I'm also going to put a link up to an earlier video where I talked about one of my Nonfiction November picks in a video that was about how to be successful in your career and what you can do from the realm of positive psychology. That book was called The Happiness Advantage. But today I want to talk about two books that I finished for Nonfiction November. These are Wake, the Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts by Rebecca Hall, and Fix It Fix, Challenging the Status Quo Through Fan Fiction, which is an edited volume edited by Kaitlin Tonti. So these books, I'll just talk briefly about which prompts for Nonfiction November they fit. So they could fit multiple prompts, but the way that I counted them, Wake, the Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, I counted this as join, thinking about people joining together to try to overthrow a corrupt and awful system. And Fix It Fix, I counted for code. So people really kind of challenging the code of literature and pop culture as it's written, and sort of the cultural codes that are embedded in those media. So I'm going to talk about Wake first. So this is a graphic nonfiction. I'll just share. I should have picked like some particularly powerful pages that I wanted to share, but I didn't. But anyway, it's graphic nonfiction. It's black and white. This page is showing the author, Rebecca Hall, who is a historian, as she's reading these really old slave records. In this case, it was records from ships that were part of the mid-Atlantic slave trade, and her just absolute horror. And she's really imagining and living the trauma of what had happened to these people in the past. So this book was fascinating because slave revolts are not covered well at all in American history, in mainstream American history. They're barely mentioned, at least in the history classes that I took in secondary school before university. They're just barely mentioned. The couple that are mentioned are like the slave revolt in Haiti, and they're slave revolts that were led by men. I don't think the leaders were even really named. I mean, it was just like a footnote in the history books. So there's a lot of research and a lot of writing that uncovers the history of those slave revolts, but the innovation that Dr. Hall is doing in this book is uncovering the very little threads of history that show that women were active participants in these slave revolts. And not only were women active participants, in many cases they were some of the main instigators and some of the main leaders of these revolts. So this book is challenging not just racism and the idea that enslaved people did not repeatedly try to overthrow their enslavers, but also sexism, the idea that women were less likely to do so, or incapable of doing so, or somehow maybe more accepting of what was happening. This book challenges those narratives. And part of how it challenges those is by showing that even when a historian goes and digs into history trying to find evidence of these things, that evidence doesn't exist. So in this book, she's detailing the breadcrumbs that she found, because the white men who were recording the history and recording the court records and things like that, they didn't think it was important to write down the names of the women who were leading the slave revolts. So she does present evidence. She's able to find multiple slave revolts where there are mentions of women leading them. Sometimes it's only in the criminal aftermath of the slave revolt that you can find that evidence. evidence. She's looking at the lists of who was put to death as a result of their involvement in the revolt. And because enslaved people were valuable workers, it was usually the leaders, people who were very highly involved, who suffered the most punishing crimes. And so if a woman experienced one of those punishments, you can assume that she played a really important role in that revolt. So she's following like that, those sorts of logical paths as she's finding these breadcrumbs. And she does this research everywhere. She conducts a lot of it in New York, looking at records. She even goes overseas to Britain to look at the old records of the companies that were involved in the mid-Atlantic slave trade. So just absolutely fascinating, a historical wake-up call for a poorly educated American whose history classes didn't cover this, of not only were there slave revolts, they happened very frequently, often on small scales, because you're talking about enslaved, oppressed people. But there was this repeated sort of constant resistance to what was going on. And not only were those slave revolts happening, but women played an important role in many of them. Women led many of them. So this was just absolutely fascinating and heartbreaking. The art, I think the art is really gorgeous and does a really great job of telling the story. So I showed the earlier picture, I showed the historian herself, as what she's imagining. You can see on this page too, we're seeing the historian again. So the book is really, it's presenting this evidence and this information, but it's doing it through the story of how she pursued her dissertation, because this was the subject of her dissertation. So that was really nice to have her personal perspective as she's pushing this work forward. So the art was really great. It's really neat. Images from the streets of New York, for example, where we see Rebecca walking, among the skyscrapers, but then wherever there's an opportunity for a reflection, maybe it's in some windows, maybe it's in a puddle in the street, the illustrator has put in an imagined scene of what that area would have looked like in the past. So you get this juxtaposition of past and present that really drives home how recent this history is, and how the ramifications are still ones that we're dealing today in terms of white supremacy and racism in the United States. So I really, really loved that way that the art really enhanced the storytelling that was happening here. So this was absolutely fantastic. Please go read it. This is getting longer than I meant to. Anyway, I will talk about Fics for a couple of minutes. So challenging the status quo through fan fictions. This is an edited volume. It is published by an academic press. This is very academic writing. It is essentially a series of, what could be academic papers that are put together in an edited volume. This is not my my area of specialty, so I did find the academicness of it was a little hard to get through. So I kept putting this book down frequently and then picking it up. But that worked fairly well, because each chapter in here is on a different topic. So I could kind of take a break and come back in between the chapters. So I'm just trying to say very academic writing. That said, it was fairly accessible academic writing. There was some sort of jargon and theory in here, but for the most part, it's analyzing pop culture. And so it's really engaging with material that we're exposed to every day. So academic, but accessible academic. So what this book was talking about is the particular subset of fan fiction that is Fix-It fan fiction. So subsets where usually there's some segment of a fan community of a work, like Harry Potter is one of the big examples, where fans are not happy with some of the choices that the author made, both within the series, like the lack of diversity of characters in Harry Potter, or in that particular example, the personal stance that the author has increasingly taken after the end of the series. And so fans of the work who find a lot of value and meaning in the world that was created, they play with elements of that world. They play with existing characters in the canon of the world, and they reimagine different stories. And in the case of something like Harry Potter, where it's now associated with transphobia because of the personal views of the author, and lack of respect and inclusion of the broader LGBTQ community as well, Fix allow an opportunity for people who really love that world and love that magic to recreate the story in a way that speaks to them and their experiences. A lot of people, a lot of like rich, famous people don't like that people do that with their work, which I find really interesting. I mean, personally, like I wouldn't want to be criticized, I guess, as like being a terrible person such that people have to fix my fiction. But the general idea of like, this is people who care so deeply about the thing that you've created that it's inspiring them to create more related to it. Like, I think that's really, really nice. So I don't read fan fiction myself. I tried reading it a little bit in college, but never really got into it. But I respect that whole world and think it's really nice. And then from the fix-it fic standpoint, like I think that's really powerful that people turn to the written word, to take these inspiring things that have been harmful and hurtful and turn them into an alternate version of what they could be. So I'm talking in particular about that fandom as a really obvious example, but there's a lot of other fandoms in here, like the Supernatural series, which I've never watched, Voltron or something, the Omegaverse, like all kinds of things I've never heard of, but it was still, you don't have to know the characters in the fandom to appreciate the critical analysis of what's happening with this fan fiction writing. So I talked about how one sort of type of this fix-it fic is just like reimagining a story and putting characters into a more diverse space, or letting them have more diverse identities. But another sort of approach to the fix-it fic that I really like that was covered in here was fix-it fiction as a way to experiment with activism, that you can play with, what would social protest or what would legal battles look like around some of the issues that we face in the real world, but you can imagine it in the framework of a particular pop culture canon and those characters. And so you can sort of play with those ideas and think about the what ifs, learn more about the legal system and sort of interrogate it through your writing in a way that's really interesting and I think potentially really has some educative power. So yeah, there's just a lot that seems really empowering about the way that people are approaching fan fiction from this fix-it fic standpoint. And I really appreciated learning more about that as someone who doesn't do that and isn't part of those communities. Being able to read sort of like this broader analysis that really thinks about, what are people doing when they're writing these stories on the internet? And there's enough people doing it, and especially for some of these more popular, TV series and movie series and things that people are writing fan fiction about. There's now like so much that it's data, so you can learn a lot about sort of cultural attitudes and social attitudes to some of the issues that are being illuminated by fan fiction from looking at those bodies of work. So I found this really interesting. It's a slim volume, so I don't want to put anybody off who might watch this and be interested by talking about it being academic and hard to read. It's a little hard to read because of that, but each chapter is digestible. And like I said, for me, putting it down between chapters, for a day or two was really helpful. So I found this just, really interesting as a work on analyzing pop culture. So those were 2 books I finished for Nonfiction November, and I am still finishing my 4th one, so I will include that at some point in a later wrap up as I finish it. It's a longer one that I've had to be putting down and coming back to. So that was my Nonfiction November. Hope you all have a good time reading whatever you're reading, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks. Bye.